The first time I realized my memories were lying, it was over something small and gentle, the way lies often begin. I was standing in the kitchen, holding a chipped blue mug that I was certain my mother had given me on my 18th birthday. I could see the moment clearly, her smile, the way the sunlight fell on the table, the warmth in her voice as she told me to be brave. The memory felt solid, emotional, undeniable. Then my sister laughed softly and said, "You bought that mug yourself." Mom hated blue. Her words unsettled me more than they should have. I wanted to argue, to defend the memory like a friend under attack, but something in her tone stopped me. It wasn't cruel or dismissive. It was kind, almost protective, as if she didn't want to take something from me but felt obligated to tell the truth. I smiled, nodded, and set the mug down, yet a thin crack opened somewhere inside my certainty. After that, I began noticing how often my past shifted under gentle pressure. Stories I told about my childhood were corrected by cousins. Moments I swore had ended in anger were remembered by others as quiet and unresolved. I had always believed memory was a recording, a faithful archive. Now it felt more like a painting that kept repainting itself while I wasn't looking. I didn't know whether to feel betrayed or relieved. When my father died, kindness arrived in forms I hadn't expected. Neighbors I barely knew left food at the door. A woman from the next street over, whose name I had never learned, sat with me on the steps one evening and said nothing at all. Her silence felt deliberate, respectful, like a hand held out but not forced into mine. Later, I would remember that moment as long and meaningful, but she would tell me years after that she'd only stayed for 5 minutes before her bus came. Both versions felt true in different ways. In the weeks after the funeral, my memories of my father softened. The sharp edges wore down. The arguments we had blurred. And the kindness he showed grew brighter, warmer, larger than life. I remembered him teaching me to ride a bicycle, running beside me, laughing when I fell. My sister insisted he'd been impatient that day, frustrated by his own exhaustion. I couldn't accept that at first. I didn't want to. The memory I carried was a gift, and it had helped me survive my grief. That was the first time I understood that some lies are not meant to deceive but to heal. I began working at the community library shortly after, a quiet place filled with people who trusted stories more than facts. There was an old man who came every morning and asked me the same question about the history section. Each time, I answered as if it were the first. My coworker once suggested gently that we remind him he'd already asked. I shook my head without thinking. It felt wrong to take away the small comfort of familiarity he was seeking. One day, he told me about his late wife, how she used to read to him every night. He described her voice, her patience, the kindness in the way she turned pages slowly so he could fall asleep without feeling rushed. Weeks later, his daughter came in and told me her mother had lost her voice years before she passed and couldn't read aloud anymore. The old man's memory wasn't accurate, but it was tender. It preserved the kindness he had felt, even if the details had shifted. I started to see how often kindness lived inside imperfect recollections. A woman remembered a teacher who believed in her when no one else did, even though the teacher had simply told her to try harder. A man remembered a stranger who paid his bus fare, though the driver later admitted he'd just waved him through. The facts mattered less than the meaning people carried forward. Still, I worried. If my memories could lie, what else was unsteady? Who was I, if the story I told myself kept changing? The answer came unexpectedly, through a child. There was a little girl who visited the library every Thursday afternoon with her grandmother. She was quiet and watchful, choosing the same book each time, a picture book about a lost dog finding its way home. One afternoon, while her grandmother browsed, the girl told me she remembered her mother reading that book to her every night before bed. Her voice was calm, almost flat, like she was stating a simple fact. I knew her mother had died when she was very young. Too young to read. Too young to remember in the way she described. I felt a familiar tension rise in me, the urge to correct, to align memory with reality. But I didn't. I smiled and said, "That sounds like a nice memory." The girl smiled back, small and grateful. In that moment, I understood that her memory wasn't lying to hurt her. It was protecting something essential, a sense of being loved and safe. The kindness wasn't in the accuracy but in the preservation of comfort. As months passed, I began to treat my own memories more gently. When I caught them shifting, I didn't immediately accuse them of betrayal. I asked instead what they were trying to do. What pain were they easing? What kindness were they holding on to? I remembered a friend who had drifted away after a misunderstanding. In my version, I had been patient and forgiving, reaching out again and again. In hers, I had been distant, proud, unwilling to listen. For a long time, I clung to my memory because it made me feel kinder than I might have been. Eventually, I wrote to her and apologized without defending myself. She replied with warmth and relief, and in that exchange, a new memory formed, one rooted not in self-protection but in humility. It surprised me how often kindness required letting go of being right. I started volunteering at a care home on weekends, reading to residents or simply sitting with them. One woman insisted she was waiting for her husband to pick her up. She spoke about him as if he were alive, working late, always running behind. The staff told me he had died decades ago. I nodded, but when she asked me to help her get ready, I did. We talked about what she'd say to him when he arrived, how she'd tease him for being late. Her happiness in those moments was real, and it mattered more than the calendar. Sometimes, after leaving, I would cry in my car, overwhelmed by the quiet heroism of small kindnesses that would never be remembered accurately by anyone. But maybe they didn't need to be. I began writing again, something I had abandoned after convincing myself I wasn't good enough. In my memory, a teacher once told me my writing was weak and self-indulgent. I carried that criticism like a scar. Years later, I found an old notebook and read the actual comment. It was careful, encouraging, honest but not cruel. The harshness had grown in my mind over time, shaped by my own doubts. Realizing this didn't erase the years of silence, but it softened my relationship with myself. My memories had lied to protect me from disappointment, and sometimes they had lied to justify my fear. Kindness, I learned, wasn't just about accepting the comforting lies but about gently correcting the harmful ones. When my sister and I talked about our childhood now, we did so with curiosity rather than competition. We compared memories not to prove who was right but to understand how differently we had survived the same moments. Where my memories painted our home as loud and chaotic, hers remembered it as lonely. Both were true, shaped by our needs at the time. One evening, we sat together, laughing over a story we both remembered wrong. The laughter itself felt like a new truth forming, one we would probably misremember later in ways that favored warmth and connection. That I still don't trust my memories the way I once did. But I no longer see that as a loss. They are not court records or surveillance footage. They are living things, shaped by love, fear, grief, and hope. They bend, not always toward truth, but often toward survival. And kindness lives in that bending. It lives in the neighbor who remembers your smile more than your silence. In the child who remembers being read to, even if the words came from somewhere else. In the way we remember the dead as gentler than they were, and the living as more forgiving than they sometimes manage to be. My memories are lying, yes. But they are also telling me something important, that being human is less about perfect accuracy and more about carrying forward what helps us be kinder, to ourselves and to one another.